Okay, hello everyone once again. It is my great pleasure to open the third and final session named Interpretive Communities, Challenging Oppression in Texts and Societies. I'll just briefly introduce the session. For the last session, we have a keynote speaker, Professor Ana Kolarić, and a presentation of Zorana Simić. Now I'll give the floor to the chair, Aleksandra Petrović.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the presenters as well as to the audience. My name is Alexandra, and I'm happy to be here today and to be a facilitator for this part of our conference. Like Jelena said, it's a third part of the conference, and its name is Interpretive Communities, Challenging Oppression in Texts and Societies. And I'm happy to briefly introduce our keynote speaker for this part of the session. We were mentioning her yesterday at our meeting in terms of her importance for young researchers engaging in periodical studies. I'm talking about Ana Kolarić. Ana Kolarić is a professor at the Department of Comparative Literature and Literary Theory at the Faculty of Philology, University of Belgrade, where she teaches at all three levels of studies: undergraduate, master, and doctoral studies. Her research interests include Anglo-American modernism, feminist theory and criticism, periodical studies, as well as critical and feminist pedagogy. I now invite her to share her research with us today, and her paper is titled Teaching with Periodicals from the Perspective of Feminist and Literary Scholar.
Thank you.
Hello again. First of all, thank you for Jelena for inviting me here to give this talk. I will first say something symbolically, because there was one person who should have been today with us and she's not. Her name is Slobodanka Peković. She was in your program, but she couldn't come today. And I would like to mention her name because she was working here for decades at this institute, and she is I would say, first woman to explore women's and feminist magazines in the time when most of us here present from Belgrade weren't even born. So if I wasn't, then for sure others weren't. So she started doing this research in the 70s, and I think it was in the late 70s that she suggested a project in exploration of women's literature in the women's and feminist periodicals. So I just wanted to mention her name because in my work and my research, she was quite of a person of significance, and she inspired a lot of things that I do today. So she's retired for 10 years maybe or something like that, but she's still part of our community. I'm sorry that she's not here today. Also, I want to say why this topic, because I choose not to talk about some concrete research that I do about some concrete journals and things like that, but to talk instead about my teaching work, because the purpose of the meeting was to introduce ourselves and to say something about the things that we do here. So when Jelena and I talked, we thought that it would be interesting to somehow describe some of the courses that I teach and simply give you a picture of what we do here when it comes to the Faculty of Philology and Periodical Studies. So this is the reason. In this presentation, I will talk about teaching with and about periodicals and introducing periodical studies in the curriculum at the Faculty of Philology, University of Belgrade. I will describe briefly the courses which I teach at all study levels, BA, MA, and PhD, and which all largely focus on women's and feminist periodicals. I will also emphasize different problems which each course highlights: theoretical, historical, methodological. Besides this, I will try as much as I can to highlight the relationship between research and activism in the feminist classroom. First of all, I would like to say that at the Faculty of Philology where I teach, there is no department for gender studies or a postgraduate program titled gender studies. So this means that lecturers, if they wish, introduce feminist theory and criticism either as first teaching units within individual courses, either mandatory or elective, or as independent courses exclusively elective. based on an insight into the programs and syllabi offered by different departments, I can say that gender studies and feminist theory and criticism are much more present in master and doctoral programs than in undergraduate studies. Also, the word gender is more often used in the titles of these courses than the word feminism, which I think is also important. Before starting courses on periodicals or a course on periodicals, I, as anyone else, had to ask a simple question: why should one teach about women's and feminist periodicals? And I will just here offer briefly few possible answers that were important for me. Women's and feminist periodicals, and especially periodicals edited exclusively by women, represent first an essential piece of evidence of the history of the women's rights movement, as well as a testimony of strong national and transnational collaboration between women, especially in the late 19th and the entire 20th century. Secondly, a women's and feminist counter-public sphere where women feminists produced, presented, but also discussed and criticized their ideas. And thirdly, a storage of essays and literary works that might have never been published elsewhere. For example, literary criticism has always been published in periodicals. If one wants to truly learn about the history of literary criticism, they ought to take periodical press into account. It's impossible to do it otherwise. And four, they also present useful guides to other sources. Let me give a concrete example. In the first explicitly feminist journal in Serbian language, Ženski pokret, or in English, Women's Movement, which was published from 1920 to 1938, mainly in the Serbian language, Ljubica Marković, a librarian, published a long report about an exhibition of books which were written by Yugoslav women authors. In her report, she provided a catalog consisting of numerous female authors, book titles, and short descriptions of each book. Moreover, in 1937, this Serbian librarian, Ljubica Marković, eloquently explained why it was important to publish such a catalog. She said female authorship in many areas and disciplines needed to be documented. At the same time, she provided future readers and researchers with large, mainly unknown material for analysis. So in this respect, it is a useful guide. Periodicals can be useful guides to other sources. I will also give several reasons why women's and feminist periodicals from the past represent such great resource for scholars who research and teach women's history and women's writing. And I will speak from the perspective of a literary scholar who teaches courses mainly in literary theory, Anglo-American modernity and modernism, feminist theory and criticism, and elective course in feminist pedagogy. So first, in the contrast to the literary canon, which usually represents only the best of literary tradition, periodicals offer more inclusive, broader understanding of a historical period and its cultural and literary production as well. Here, women started publishing their own press. So in Serbia, at the end of the 19th century, women's periodicals described women's position in a society at the time, but they also served as tools for changing that position. So at the same time, they were both descriptive and also normative in a way. Women gained a voice, some of them a profession as well, by editing periodicals or by writing for them. Thus, women's and feminist periodicals often represent better testimony of women's writing than standard literary histories. By analyzing those magazines, scholars contribute to the history of women's and feminist press and also to the history of the women's movement. Secondly, when gender is used as both an object of analysis and category of analysis in periodical studies, then already established literary and cultural histories somehow begin to change. The revision of modernism, for example, that has been going on for the last 3 decades is a good example. Feminist revisions and rewritings of so-called official knowledge about modernity and modernism provided us with new knowledge about women editors, women journalists, and women literary critiques from the early 20th century. This new knowledge confirms that literary tradition and canon are never neutral and universal, but always selective and biased in a way. Thus, critical interpretations that reflect upon politics of gender, class, race, etc., question the supposed neutrality of a literary tradition and canon. Also, let me give a concrete example here. In one of the most popular literary histories in the Serbian language, it was written by Jovan Deretic. It's called History of Serbian Literature, which is still widely used in the literary departments focused on Serbian literature, and they can testify to this, who graduated from this department. Only a few women writers have been mentioned. So students who graduate from the Department of Serbian Literature and then go to high schools and elementary schools to teach literature firmly believe that there were only 2, maybe 3 Serbian women writers that were worth mentioning. Of course, the reality is very different, but if these students do not have some personal interest to explore this different reality, then they will go to elementary and high schools knowing about 2 or 3 important female writers, not only knowing only about them, but believing this is all that has to be said about women writings. So women's and feminist periodicals prove that many more women writers ought to be considered. Thirdly, periodical studies acknowledge the significant role of editors. Editors create the politics of a journal, convey specific worldviews, and often influence younger authors. However, more often than not, editors were forgotten the second their publishing house or journal was closed, or when they passed away. So they were mainly influential while they were alive, but once they were not, sometimes their names were simply forgotten. The analysis of women's and feminist magazines, especially magazines from the early 20th century, brings to light the significant role women had as editors of the modern and modernist magazines. So we have examples like tons of examples in English language, but also in Serbia in our context. And I believe that Zorana Simić will talk about that after me. Fourth, one must keep in mind the fact that editors and contributors to women's and feminist magazines lived and worked in a very specific cultural, social, and political context, and were, at least to some extent, immersed in the ideologies of their own time. Thus, it is of the utmost importance to always contextualize and historicize their texts, or as Rita Felsky says in her book, for example, in Gender of Modernity, feminist scholars need to be empathetic and critical at the same time. Empathetic means that we should carefully engage with voices of the past and take seriously past women's and men's own understanding of their positioning within historical and social process. On the other hand, critical means that we can and should learn from the past. For example, scholars may analyze certain discourses from the past in order to identify if they had or still have implications for our present or future lives and in what ways they can do that. And finally, and I think this is important, especially from the perspective of scholars who work with periodical press, and especially feminist scholars, working with women's and feminist periodicals forces feminist, or should force feminist scholars to think carefully about their own role as editors and authors. So what we do as editors of magazines or as authors who contribute to certain magazines. Where do we publish? How do we choose where we want to publish and what kind of message, if any, we want to convey to what kind of audience? Who are we talking to? Are we talking to somebody at all? So these are some of the questions that I think that periodical and periodical studies actually force you to think about or to rethink if you had some thoughts about it before. Also, one of the questions that I think it's really important is feminism present in our scholarly articles? Is that something that feminism, in a way, is a political project? In which way is or is not present in our articles? Who do we imagine as our implicit readers when we write about literature or about feminism? Do we perceive mainly academic journals, which we edit and in which we publish, as places that could and should foster social and political transformation? Do we think about social and political transformation at all? Finally, should we enter the public sphere by using more accessible and open platforms than academic journals? So these are some of the questions that especially periodicals from the early 20th century, feminist periodicals, force you to ask. I will now briefly turn to concrete courses that I teach, bearing these questions and points in mind. And I will talk about the syllabi based on my personal experience in the design and implementation of courses at the level of undergraduate and postgraduate studies. And for this occasion, I have chosen to describe 4 courses, briefly, believe me, one of which belongs to the undergraduate program, while 3 belong to MA and PhD program. These courses focus on feminist knowledge production in general, with special attention paid to women's and feminist periodicals. So since 2014, I have taught a mandatory course, this is important, it's mandatory course, on modernity, modernism, and literary criticism to 4th-year students, so BA students. The syllabus of this course is divided into 2 parts. The articles in the reader for the first part of the course focus on concepts of modernity and modernism. Together with usual must-read authors and articles, the students also learn about the gender of modernity and feminist revisions of dominant representation of literary modernism. The articles in the reader for the second part of the course focus on the modern periodical studies. Feminist revisions and rewritings of official knowledge about modernity and modernism provide plenty information about women editors, women journalists, and women literary critiques from the early 20th century. And this is something that I underline in the syllabus and in discussions in the class, that this is important part of the literary tradition. I will give you one concrete example. Students are sometimes students of comparative literature and literary theory, which is the department where I teach. Students are sometimes aware of the existence of famous modernist magazine, The Egoist, in which T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Ezra Pound published their works. This is why some of the students are aware of this magazine. They, however, do not know that this magazine was financed and led mainly by women. One of those women, Dora Marsden, was the editor and co-editor in 3 related modern magazines, Free Woman, New Free Woman, and The Egoist. For example, she was the one who accepted Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, for serial publishing in The Egoist. Yet, until recently, her name and important work were missing from the curriculum, or in case of the comparative literature and literary studies department, it was completely missing. So, because there were no classes on periodicals at all. In October, when the school year starts, none of the students from my BA course have ever heard of Dora Marsden, which is not something that I complain about. This is just simply stating the facts. Or the magazine Free Woman. Some students openly ask in the class why they need to read and learn about women's and feminist movement, journals, and editors in the mandatory course. So if it's a mandatory course, why do these things? Like, this is not mandatory material from their standpoint. Then I emphasize that modernity and modernism cannot be fully understood without such knowledge, and support my claims with primary and secondary readings. If some students still have doubts about the importance of women and their professional experience for modernism, I ask them to provide counter-arguments based on the relevant secondary readings. So to simply come to the class with different standpoint than this one, and to explain why we shouldn't do these things. Well, this didn't happen until now. In May, when the course finishes, many of the students refer to Dora Marsden and her work without any hesitation, which is something which says a lot about education and educational process. Like, when you teach something, which is also good news and bad news at the same time, people believe you. They think this is important. So it's a good news when you speak about Dora Marsden. It's a bad news in some other context. Should be careful with what you teach. Some even decide to dig deeper into women's and feminist periodicals. This only confirms, of course, that curriculum and production of knowledge are always shaped by our own politics, preferences, and beliefs, and that they are never neutral, some neutral objective projection of tradition or canon. Second course. In the focus of the course, which I teach at the master level, are the concepts of genre and gender, and the course itself is titled Genre and Gender. And women's and feminist periodicals serve as a ground for exploring and questioning these concepts and their interrelationship. Students read and analyze examples from women's and feminist periodicals from the beginning of the 20th century, then from those from the interwar period, along with contemporary popular magazines and academic feminist journals. In classes, for example, we discuss women's genres, such as the romance novels, as well as the genre of feminist literary criticism in different historical and political contexts. We also talk about feminist internet platforms that have largely replaced traditional feminist magazines. Furthermore, we talk about popular culture from a feminist perspective. Those two topics, feminism on the internet and feminism in popular culture, prove to be particularly interesting to students as they open up space for a critical analysis of cultural phenomena that are an integral part of their everyday life. Thirdly, and fourthly, I have 2 PhD courses, and they are somehow connected. There is a strong link between those 2 courses. Both aim to present the histories of the women's movement and women's writing as recorded in the range of journals published from the end of the 19th century to the present day. The first course is titled Women's Feminist, and there is no great word in English for this, Feminophile Press in Serbia / Yugoslavia from the 1890 to 1941. And this course examines the concepts of modernity, modernization, and modernism by using gender as both object of analysis and category of analysis. The Women's Feminist and Feminophile Press, this feminophile means it wasn't edited by women, but it was strongly cheering up women in their fight for different rights. And women published in those journals, but they were not editors. So the Women's Feminist and Feminophile Press published in that period described existing ideal types of women and at the same time produced new types. During the semester, we explored different aspects of emancipation, education, right to vote, right to work and be paid for it, marriage, divorce, reproductive rights, abortion, all the problems that were important in this period, as well as different historical, social, and political conditions in which women fought for certain rights, because it wasn't the same thing writing about, for example, vote in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and interwar period in Serbia/Yugoslavia. It was a very different campaign. The second PhD course is titled, and obviously I like these long titles, I don't know why. So it's titled Bringing Theory, Activism, and Cultural Practices Together, Feminist Press in Serbia in the 90s and 2000s. And this course deals with contemporary feminist press, focusing on both activist and academic journals published in that period. Some of these journals, mostly academic ones, are still being published. During the semester, I pay special attention to the breakup of Yugoslavia and anti-nationalist and pacifist engagement of feminist women in the 90s. This course presents a rare occasion, I would say, in which students read texts by authors who spoke openly against the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s. Many of those authors later wrote about war crimes as well. Of course, when I describe now these courses, it seems like they cover everything, and definitely I'm just one human, so it's not that I know about all the magazines and stuff. So of course I follow my nose and my personal interests and research interests. But also I have to mention that many of these courses are in a way collaborative work. So you know what other people do. You use their articles. Sometimes you ask them to come to give a lecture and things like that. So it's not like I'm going to do it all by myself. The basic goal of the described courses is, of course, the production and legitimization of feminist knowledge in higher education. All courses, I hope so, challenge the so-called legitimate knowledge from a feminist perspective. Students learn broadly about women's and gender history, the history of women's movements, as well as about women's writing, not only literary writing in a narrow sense. They also learn about feminist spaces today, such as online portals, for example, for analysis of popular culture from feminist perspective. And from my perspective, most importantly, they learn about different ways to apply feminist knowledge outside the classroom. So not only when they write essays for their exams. In addition to lectures and discussions in the classroom, there are also some visible concrete results and effects of the mentioned courses. And this sounds like me coming from the humanities and wanting to say something about visible results and concrete results. No, I'm kidding. It's not something that can be measured, but I would like to say that many students publish academic papers based on the research which they've done within these courses, while some of them choose topics for their master and doctoral dissertations in the field of women's and feminist periodicals, which I cherish the most. And in described courses, what I try, I'm not sure if I'm successful enough. I try to create a safe space for young researchers where they can talk about feminist topics in the past,